Shalom and welcome everyone. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. David Levy in his second virtual lecture in the lecture series entitled Censorship of the Jewish Books. In his first lecture, he discussed the censorship of the Rambam's Guide for the Perplexed. This second lecture will be about love, reverence, and cherishing of texts as a Rabbinic Torah Ethic.
Toda Rabba Alita Portnoy for that wonderful introduction, which notes that today, in continuing the series on the censorship of Hebraica and Judaica, we will be looking at the reverence, love, and cherishing of Sfarim, both oral and written text, by the rabbinic ethos of Torah learning. And this is so crucial to connect the link that why have our enemies identified the secret vitality and energized secret of the Jewish people, the lifeblood of the Jewish people, is in learning. And learning often comes from the transmission oral and written text. I want to give a shout out again to Rabbi Weisblum, who I've been blessed and lucky to know for 18 years, and who has showered me with countless blessings, and I owe an immense debt of gratitude for his invitation to appear this evening in this series on the censorship of the Jewish books. So Alita really hit the nail on the head by noting that the love, reverence, and cherishing of Jewish text is one of the reasons why Jewish texts have been censored, because our enemies are often not stupid. They realize that if you want to go after the Jews, you go after their lifeblood, which is learning, which often comes through transmission of teachers and text. And teachers are like text. Everybody is a text yearning to be interpreted. And when Heinrich Heine noted in reference to Jewish books that when books are burned, people will be burned, there's a kernel of truth in that, in some sense, because the Nazi book burnings were foreshadowed by massive burnings by the Hitler Jugend, Yamach Shemo, the Boy Scouts of the Nazis, throughout Germany, which started in Berlinplatz and throughout the lands of Europe, where Jewish books of priceless Hebrew unique manuscripts were torched, as well as secular, more recent literature of Sigmund Freud, Stefan Zweig, and even non-Jews like Thomas Mann, who was a Philo-Semite. Tonight, however, we will be focusing on why our enemies are not wrong, that if you want to destroy the Jewish people, you go after their text. And their texts, which give the life-living vitality of the Jewish people, which is a Masorah, a living tradition, as Rav Saadia Gaon would say. The Nazis wanted a museum to the murdered Jewish, quote, race, although Jews are a religion. We come in all different nationalities and colors. There are Ethiopian Jews, Chinese Jews, Indian Jews, Ashkenaz Jews, Sephardic Jews of all sorts. And so Judaism is really a religion, but the Nazis, of course, according to Yaakov Katz, had a racial anti-Semitism that wanted to make a museum to the murdered Jewish race. And what they were going to have in that museum were Sifrei Kodesh, and also Judaica and Hebraica, and really museum traces to the Jews. But books are not museum pieces to Jews. The Rambam, to continue the previous lecture on internal censorship of the Guide for the Perplexed, the Mara Nevuchim, Sefer Mara Nevuchim, what in French is like Guide des Égarés, this book, Rambam notes in the introduction, Hakadma, is a key, a maftiach, where the Rambam says the pilgrim soul, that is the learner of this text, will gain access by opening doors in a palace of many antechambers, 7 heavens, so to speak, and the soul will be initiated and enter into these chambers and delighted and refreshed with fountains of wisdom by angelic hosts that give over Sitrei Torah, or the secrets of Torah, as Eliyahu Hanavi is prophesies to do, B'yamei Mashiach, clearing up all the contradictions in the Shas and other rabbinic conundrums. So the text itself is likened to a key, and who would not want keys to open doors of a life redeemed? Who would not want, the other metaphor the Rambam compares this sefer to, is a precious gem. He says that I am a deep sea diver who have dove down into the bottoms of the sea and brought up precious pearls and other gems that have been shipwrecked on the bottom of the seabed, fathoming the great depths of the sea. The Talmud itself is called this Yam Gadol. Rabbi Ruderman himself was called the swimmer of the sea, because in Kovna he would swim across the river there, and he was a great swimmer. And so the Tanaim too were called great swimmers of the Sea of Galilee, and big fish in the Galilee. But the point is, whether you liken the Sefer to a key that opens gates in heaven, or whether you liken a Sefer to a precious gem, this is the lifeblood of the Jewish people. Now, Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik has warned that as a result of the printing press, Jews have become too bookish, and he thinks that we have to recognize that Torah Shebal Peh is coterminous with Torah Shebakatav, the written Torah. That is to say, when Rashi says Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai, it doesn't say HaTorah. If it had said HaTorah, it would be the written Torah. And there are many Philo-Semites, learned Jesuits, who know the written Torah really well. The secret of the Jew, the mysterium perplexus, is the oral Torah. And the oral Torah, Rashi is saying, is coterminous at the Har Sinai revelation with the written Torah. Because if it had said HaTorah, then only the written Torah, 24 books of the Tanakh, would have been handed down. But instead, the Gadata holds that Hashem showed Moshe Rabbeinu Rabbi Akiva darshaning every crown, if not every crown, every turning, flowering of every crown on the Torah. And so the oral Torah is so important too. So with that caveat aside, we're going to look at the importance of text, both written and oral. So let's go back to one of the greatest Talmud scholars in the last 500 years, the Gra, the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon likens the Babylonian Talmud, which is behind me, to 62 queens. Indeed, there's 62 tractates, oversized tractates, because the way Jews learn is by learning by an authoritative reception history. We don't just go to the Mishnah and then the Gemara. We go through a maze and a labyrinth of all the commentaries that have accrued, oodles and oodles, over the last 2 millennium. If the Mishnah was written down in 210, and the Bavli and Pumbedita Sur and Nahardia around 425, many commentaries have arisen as a labyrinth maze that one must go through to penetrate to the earlier rings in the tree, or the earlier waves of a pebble dropped in a pond, if you will, like in the metaphor of Revelation Har Sinai. So when the Gra says the 62 tractates of the Talmud are the 62 queens, he's saying that's a core text that was written down by Rav Ashi and Rava in Babylon, right before the Gaonic times, in the Amoraic period. And the Gemara, of course, is a commentary on the Mishnah, which in some senses Dr. Shmuel Rosenblatt notes is a commentary on the Tanakh. So it all goes back to one revelation of Moshe on Har Sinai, the revelation event that we celebrate on Shavuos by staying up all night. But over the time, things have come written down due to crisis where we risk being forgotten. So certain Gedolim have had the authority to write down Torah Shebal Peh, even though it's not supposed to be written down, in order to break the law to save the law. That was part of the lecture in the first series. So when the Gra says the 62 tractates are the 62 queens, there are millions of other rabbinic texts. You know, they would take more space than Manhattan to fill up all the Hebrew works that have been written just on super commentaries on the Talmud. So those the Gra refers to as the maidens that serve the queen. The queen are the 62 tractates, 62 queens, and all the myriads of other rabbinic texts are the maidens who serve the queen. So clearly we have a beautiful metaphor of the Gra, who was interested in Girsa. He collected manuscripts, and in fact, he set out in Europe. He said he would walk barefoot to meet the Ramhal in Italy. But he also collected manuscripts to compare versions of the Talmud in particular. Now, let's lighten this things up. On Megillas Esther, and celebrated in Purim, little children dress up as Sifrei Torah, Torah scrolls. Why do they do that? Well, there's an agadata that everybody is like a letter in the Torah. Maybe some gedolim and really great rabbis are maybe a whole word or even a pasuk in the Torah. But children are dressing up and they're sending us a message. They're sending us a message that everybody is a text, a sacred work that yearns to be interpreted. So when we see little children running around on Purim dressed up as Mordecai and Esther and as Sifrei Torah, we're receiving a revelation that there's something very true, that everybody is a text that yearns to be interpreted. And we strive to add holiness to our lives, Kedusha, as the Talmud is holy, as the Mishnah is holy, as the Tanakh is holy, etc. Now, let's go to the Middle Ages. In Provence, in the south of France in the 13th century, Rabbi Yehuda ibn Tibbon, I referred to him in the first lecture on the Rambam, where he says to the Rambam, when can I meet you to translate the Moreh Nevuchim from Arabic, Dalad Alarin, to Hebrew? And the Rambam noted, as I said before, he's so busy he can only meet with him between Musaf and Mincha on Shabbos, because as a physician he wakes up before the sun rises and gets on a donkey and goes to the Sultan's court and attends to the aristocracy. He returns to the Jewish quarter at nightfall on the donkey, and he's so exhausted he prescribes medicines while lying on a couch until the wee hours of the morning. That's the Adler recension. And so this Rabbi Yehuda ibn Tibbon came from a great rabbinic dynasty. All of his sons were great scholars to boot. And he makes a remark to one of his sons about the importance of manuscripts and collecting manuscripts to be learned. He says, make your books your companions. Let your bookshelves be your gardens. Bask in their beauty. Gather their fruit. Pluck their roses. Enjoy the spice and myrrh of their great delight. And when your soul be weary, change from garden to garden and from prospect to prospect. And Rabbi Yehuda ibn Tibbon goes on and notes to his son that if you lend a manuscript to somebody, make sure you keep a list and put their name, and when they return it, cross it out, because you don't want the things to abscond. Okay, so that's somebody who has great reverence for text, a great rabbinic family. That Rabbi Yehuda ibn Tibbon translated Sefer Emunot V'Deot from Arabic into Hebrew, Sefer Chovot Levavot of Rav Bachim and Beguda into Hebrew from the Arabic. The first one was by Rav Sajagon, Sefer Emunot V'Deot, and he translated the Kuzari from Arabic into Hebrew. And likewise, Sefer Moreh Nevuchim. There are other translations of the Moreh Nevuchim, the Kapach edition, and many others. Legid Zezagare, we mentioned of Shlomo Monk in the first lecture. There are editions in Chinese even. The Tanya, the Baal Tanya, Rabbi Shimon Zalman Ladia, his masterwork, as well as Shulchan Aruch Harav, has been translated in almost all languages of the world. Another great sage, Rabbi Yehuda Levi, says, my pen is my harp and my lyre, that is the musical instrument. My library is my garden and my orchard. Nivli v'kinori b'fi iti, gani upardes sifriya. Isn't that a beautiful statement by somebody who reveres text and also the creative process of writing text? Only Hashem creates yesh mi'ayin, but human beings construct things or deconstruct things in writing texts, and occasionally a great gadol will have a chiddush. Rabbi Yehuda Levi's statement appears in the Brody edition, number 110 of a poem called Yonah Tikanein. It's in the Van Hu Sefer Kolel Kol Shirei Yehuda Halevi Im Hagahot U Ve'orim Ve'im Mavo Me'et Chaim Brody. It was published in Berlin and around the 1900s, and on page 166, line 37, you'll find that quote of Rabbi Yehuda Levi, who had great revering for text and cherishing text, in that poem. Let's go on to the next rabbi, Rabbi Yitzhak ben Yosef of Corvey. Lived in France. He wrote a work called Sefer Mitzvot Katan, composed in 1276 in France. And around 1276, he outlines a detailed strategy and plan for dissemination of his Halakhic code, and asserts that every community should use communal funds to copy his Halakhic code and keep it for the public to consult on a daily basis. And this is remarkable. This is someone, not a public library policy, but somebody who believes that books should not be, or manuscripts rather, the province of just the wealthy who can finance their own sofrim to produce them, which Malachi Beit Ari says the majority of texts in the Middle Ages, manuscripts were done by wealthy patrons who would hire sofrim to copy texts. And we'll see more of that later. Now, Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid, living in Spain, he was a Spanish statesman and aristocrat who had great influence on the government and a Talmud Chacham to boot. He says, the wise of heart will abandon ease and pleasures, for in his Sifriya library he will find his greatest, truest treasures. Rabbi Abraham ibn Daud, in his Sefer HaKabbalah, notes that Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid had sofrim copy Mishnah and Talmudim, and he used to donate these commissioned core texts to students who could not afford to purchase them in the academies in Spain. In an earlier period, the Chai Gaon, we're talking about the Gaonic period now, not the Rishonim, the head of the Beit Din in 998 in Amamberdita, commented, 3 possessions should you prize: a field, a friend, and a sefer, a manuscript in his time. The Chai Gaon mentions that a book is more reliable than even friends, for sacred books span across time, indeed express eternal ideas that can transcend time itself and enter into the perpetual eternal peace of Torah that is a flowing river. Rabbi Shimon ben Zemach Duran, who was a Rishon, to skip time period again, known as the Tashbaz, he wrote in his work Sefer HaZohar Arakia, in the introduction, Hakadma, a beautiful pasuk that I gathered, and it's one of my cherished thoughts, and I keep it always in the forefront of my mind. He writes, when a wise person lies down with his ancestors, he should strive beforehand to leave behind him a treasured and organized blessing. Sfarim that enlighten like the brilliance of the firmament. And then he cites Daniel chapter 12:3, that some will shine like Zohar Arakia and merit praise. And then he cites, and that extend peace like an eternal river flowing forever. That's Yeshayahu 66:12. Beautiful thought of somebody who cherished Sfarim. Rabbi Yehuda Campion, a Spanish rabbi of the 14th century, we're now going to speed forward, interprets a verse from Pirkei Avot, acquire thyself a companion. And he says, that should mean acquire thyself a book. For the book can transmit wisdom, but not every companion can. Further, if he is diligent, one who increases books increases wisdom. So he's making a drush on wonderful pesukim that show the importance of text, written text in this case. Now, let's speak way forward to the Chavetz Chaim, Gadol Bador, famous for his Mishnah Berurah and many other works. And many people don't realize his most famous work was, or most favorite work, was a commentary on Sifrei, if I'm not mistaken. But he also wrote pamphlets for Jews who were drafted in the Cantonist system to serve in the military. How do you keep kosher? Remember Daniel in Sefer Daniel ate vegetables. And the Chavetz Chaim wrote many works, most well known for his works on Sefer Hilchot, Isurei Lashon Hara. But he wrote many things. And this is one of my most favorite comments of the Chavetz Chaim, which I'm going to translate. Behold, Ribbono Ha'olam, the honor which thy people Israel bestows on thee. Just look down from heaven and see the crowns with which they have crowned your holy Torah. Thou hast given to thy people a Torah small in size, yet see how many mighty towers they have built upon it by writing holy commentaries and super commentaries. They studied every word, every letter, every dot. All of these they have adorned and illumined with the ornaments of white pearls, bright sapphires, and diamonds. Just consider the two Talmudim, Bavli and Yerushalmi, and then the chaplets of grace without number, the Midrashim, Sefer HaZohar, Sifra, Sifrei, Mekilta, the Tosefta, the Alfasi, the Rambam, the Rishonim, the Achronim. Consider also the circumstances under which these expansions of the palace of Torah were created, in the long and bitter exile, between fire and the sword, under the conditions beyond human endurance, and yet they studied and learned and wrote and relearned and relearned. So, dear Master of the universe, why art thou wrathful and impatient with thy people Israel? Do you have any other nation to compare that cherishes Hebrew books and the text? Therefore, how long, dear Father in heaven, wilt thou allow thy faithful people Israel to endure its sorrows and sufferings in Galut? I'm just going to touch this. There's so much that can be said about this wonderful remark of the Chavetz Chaim's reverence and love and cherish of text. But he uses the word hashkifa. He says, just look down from heaven and see the crowns with which they have crowned thy holy Torah. Hashkifa is the gematria of 500, according to the Baal HaTurim, and that is the distance between each of the Rikiot in the seven heavens. So when Ben Zoma emerges in Masechet Hagiga and says the distance between the first Rikiah and the second Rikiah is that of a dove's wings beating, that's what I mean that Ben Zoma is not crazy. He's hinting, giving remezim to some esoteric ideas about something truly remarkable. And the Baal HaTurim continues. The word Hashkifa 500 is the gematria when you divvy up Puruvuvu, to be fruitful and multiply, by spelling out the letters, you come up with 500 as well. So there's lots of secrets to be found in the Chavetz Chaim. He doesn't throw away any word or any letter. Everything is carefully written as in any great sefer. Now, let's just go back to basic halakha. The love and reverence for Jewish books is seen in Jewish law. It is not permissible for a sacred text to lie on the ground. And if by accident a book is dropped to the floor, what do? We pick it up and we give it a kiss. And we don't leave Sfarim open. We close them out of respect for their contents. We do not hold a sefer upside down. It is not permitted to place a book of lesser sanctity on top of a book of higher sanctity. So, for example, nothing would ever go on top of a Mikraot Gedolot, for instance. One must never put any book whatsoever on top of a Tanakh. If one says, please hand me this sefer, the book should be given with the right hand and not with the left hand. If two men are walking, or two people, the one who is carrying the sacred book should be given the courtesy of entering and leaving the doorway or room first, as the second is enjoined, based on a pasuk in the Torah, pursue knowledge. So this is one of the reasons why you never want to, and even on Simchat Torah, to be pursued by a Sefer Torah. I make sure on Simchat Torah that I walk following a Sefer Torah. It's sort of hard because we make 7 hakafot, and by the way, in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, I can't resist bringing this down, it's so remarkable. He notes that the 7 circuits of the Sifrei Torah, the first go to the Kohanim, the second to the Levim, the third to the Yisraelim, etc., those are really mirrors of the 7 planets. It was thought there were 7 planets then, and in fact on Simchat Torah, what we're doing in celebrating with the Sefer Torah and carrying it about in these circuits is imitating, I guess, the heavenly bodies' orbits. And the Rambam, of course, said on Simchat Torah, one should just learn in the corner quietly. He was a little bit not into the extravagances of wild, ecstatic, mystical fervor that people could go into at that time when the circle is closed. Because what happens? You read the first chapter of Breshit soon after. Let's go back to the'. Rabbi David ibn Zimra of the 16th century, an Achron, wrote more than 3,000 responsa, that's quite a lot, and volumes on halacha and sifrei Kabbalah. What does he say, halakhically? That if one buys a new sefer, he should recite over it the benediction of Shechianu. Remarkable. Thanking Hashem for letting them arrive at that day in health and happiness, to be able to cherish and love and revere a sefer. Shows how important Sfarim were to Rabbi David ibn Zimra. Halachas devoted to the merits of lending books or not lending books. Rabbi Asher ben Yehiel of Germany in 1250 in Toledo, later in 1328, endorsed a legal decision to fine an owner who refused to lend a sefer 10 golden coins a day, testifying not only to the shortage of books and manuscripts at that time, their precious worth, private nature of book ownership, Rav Asher's personal view that knowledge is a common good of the Jewish people and treasury of the Jewish people is implicit in his decision that one should share the good. And very quickly the fish and loaves multiply. When you have texts, the Rambam not only compares this text to a key that will open the gates in heaven, which you'll need when your pilgrim soul makes that journey, but not only to a diamond or a sapphire or a gem, the Rambam compares this to your lifeline to get closer to Hashem, and that you should know Hashem. And when he was writing this sefer for Rabbi Yosef Aknin, probably, who was a scientist and physician who knew rabbinics, they were separated geographically, so the sefer becomes very important. But he said you should learn this sefer so well that you'll just gaze upon the chapter headings eventually, and your mind will take you there. The mind, in Greek, nous. That's the construct in Greek, noesis, noesis, the understanding of understanding. Lavdil, it doesn't mean bina. Bina in Hebrew is understanding, and it is a feminine aspect of Chochmah Bina B'das. Let's go back to illustrations of the importance of text to the rabbis. Private collections existed in the Middle Ages, and they were often sponsored by philanthropists. A rare example of an early example of a book proposed for a large liturgical synagogue is found in the Bodleian Library from the 14th century by a scribe named Rabbi Yaakov. The phenomena of privately commissioned but publicly used liturgical texts in the Middle Ages for a cantor can be identified, for instance, in the well-known Worms 1272 Moxer. I take that from Malachi ben Ari. But you have to realize, in the Gaonic time, even Siddharim were very rare. People just knew the text by memory, Bapeh. And so Torah Shabbat was very important because books were expensive. You had to hire somebody, a sofer, who would tevel in a mikna every time he would write the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. I mean, this is a lot of time and effort. Even the writing materials were expensive in the Middle Ages. So in 1242, when 24 cartloads of Talmud volumes are burned outside of Notre Dame Cathedral, that's a major, major indent. That's a lot of capital. Those are very expensive texts. It's not like the printing press today, which, can rattle off text quickly. In the interest of time, let's speed ahead. A well-known sofer like Rabbi Yoel ben Simeon copied and illustrated many Haggadot. He was often commissioned by wealthy patrons, and in the colophon he would write and acknowledge their patronage. Another example, Rabbi Yehiel ben Yehokitel HaRofei, the sofer of the manuscript of the Yerushalmi from 1289 in the Leiden Library, MS 4720, was commissioned to copy 3 other manuscripts and is identified as the author of Malot Hamidot, something called Sefer Tanya, different from the Balatanya, Rabbi Shneur Zalman Ladia, and Hilkot Shchita. So I just mentioned this to show that there was a lot of private sponsorship of patrons who employed Sofrim to copy texts. The majority of Hebrew books were privately commissioned according to Malachi Beit Ari, based on his findings in the Cairo Geniza, and also his establishment of a major database. I think it's called Sifriya database. I'll look up the name. Also, interestingly enough, Sefer HaChassidim, which I have behind me, in addition from the 1700s, of the German pietist movement, provide rich information about medieval books in general and on scribal practices in particular, about the importance of books. This was from the Hasdei Ashkenaz. They would tevel in ice water. They fasted a lot. They were somewhat ascetic. And in this Sefer HaChassidim, they mention the importance and reverence of text. So in Europe and Italy, certain lists can be found on the back of manuscripts of private owners of manuscripts from private libraries. Such examples include that of the physician Rabbi Abraham Finzi and his family, Rabbi Yitzhak and Mordecai Finzi of Mantua. Other private libraries lists include 156 Sparim, or manuscripts rather, by Rabbi Yehuda Leon Mosconi of Uraka around 1375. And there are many of these inventories that are found from the Cairo Geniza, and they illustrate how rare books were, manuscripts rather, that they were expensive to make, and they constituted a lot of investment of capital and time and effort. The name of the database that was pioneered by Malachi Beit Ari is Safar Database, SFARDATA database, and it tries to list the exemplars of manuscripts throughout all the major library manuscript collections in Europe and in Israel and elsewhere. So let's go on. Cairo Geniza is an important place for these inventories of books, or manuscripts, I should say. Rabbi Yosef Solomon del Medigo worried about the invention of printing, that it would be responsible in a bad way for a kind of smugness. Oh, now that it's so easy to run off a book on a printing press, I don't need to memorize it and internalize its contents by sublimating it. And he was very concerned, Rabbi Solomon del Medigo, that it would be a dumbing down process, that in the Middle Ages, when you had people privately copying manuscripts, the texts were learned by memory. The Confucian tradition is like that. The Sanskrit tradition is like that. These things are passed down orally, and when they're written down, it's a matter where they're known very well. But obviously the printing press had its day. So let's speed forward to the formation of the modern state of Israel. 1948, the great Rabbi Isaac Halevi Herzog, who wrote his dissertation on Techelet. The liner, the Mei HaShloach dynasty thought that it was this type of fish that produced the blue ink, but Rabbi Herzog argued it was the particular snail, and scientific data today from the Techelet Institute indicates it was this snail. I just want to note the importance of Rabbi Herzog's work before I note his statements about the reverence of text. In his work on Techelet, he not only gives a scientific and archaeological analysis of why this particular snail off the Mediterranean was probably the source for the dyeing process that allowed one to put Techelet in the tzitzit. Everybody knows the Gemara, that the blue in the tzitzit remind you of the Mediterranean blue-green waters, which remind you of the Rakia, the beautiful blue sky, which has different tints of blue on different days, which remind you of the throne of Hashem, Sapir. Remember in Shemot, it says the elders had a meal, and below their feet, the throne of Hashem appeared as a sapphire. And in fact, that throne reminds you of the Luchot themselves, according to an Agadata. Well, anyway, this snail that produces this dye that can be converted into the appearance of a blue and purple, which changes in the presence of the sun, it's very important because there's a historian named Flavius Josephus who wrote on Herod's temple, which he had witnessed before the destruction by the Romans in 70 CE, around then, 68 CC, if you will, CE. And Josephus notes that Herod's temple used modern technology. The Romans were great technological. They made roads, the Rashbi says, for their own purposes, and their marketplaces for preachers. But one of their technologies was not only hydraulic concrete to make the harbor of Caesarea, which is still an amazing technological invention because you still have calm waters in Caesarea because of the way they had concrete hardened underwater to create a space where ships can dock. But they also had a technology of painting marble with blue. Okay? So Josephus points out in the Antiquities that when he witnessed the Beit HaMikdash of Herod, the marble was not white as we think of Washington, D.C.'s neoclassical architecture based on the Greek model, but it was blue. It was painted blue marble. And so when the sun was up, it ricocheted off the gold dome of the Beit HaMikdash, and the light shimmered on the painted blue marble. Wow. What kind of effect was that? That was the effect of beautiful blue of the Mediterranean Sea, which reminds us of that Gemara, that the blue and the tzitzit remind us of the Mediterranean, which reminds us of the throne of Hashem from the Rakia, which reminds us of the Luchot, if you will. So it's not about imagination. Blue makes you start imagining things. It's that Herod's temple was painted blue marble, and when sunlight ricocheted off a gold dome of the Beit HaMikdash and played upon the blue painted marble, it appeared as beautiful shimmering blue. But don't be deceived. Often Greek wisdom is beautiful on the outside, but it's skin deep. Because, let's face it, it was marble. If you dove in there because you thought it was the Mediterranean Sea, you'd crack your head open. So in Chagiga, which I referenced in the first lecture, and Rabbi Akiva says, Al tamru mayim, do not say water, water. What could possibly go on the most simple Peshat level in that Gemara, in the Arba Shenik Nesuba Pardes, in the Chagiga 12b, the 14b, is that Rabbi Akiva also saw the Beit HaMikdash. And he knew Greek wisdom was beautiful on the outside, but deceptive on the outside often, particularly in the realm of ethical, moral aspects. And therefore, do not say water, water, because that shimmering blue Mediterranean sparkling of the sunlight on Herod's blue-painted marble is not really water. And there's no sheker before Hashem's throne. Don't say any falsehood. It's an illusion. And Greek thought is very beautiful. It says, bring the beauty of Yafet into the tents of Shem. And yes, there are redeeming things about aspects of the classical tradition. Remember, the Maccabees were against Gagan, Neged, the Syrian Hellenized Greeks. They weren't against the Greeks from Peloponnesia. We are approaching, at this time of the recording of the YouTube, Hanukkah, which will, I think, happen on December 9th this year and 10th. The first night, 8 days of Hanukkah. And so I'm going to read for you a section from the book of Maccabees. And basically, it's about the burning of Sifrei Torah. This finds itself in the Apocrypha, what Rambam calls the Sefer HaChitzonim. Other people think it might be Ben Sira, of the Catholic canon. And I'm first going to say it in translating from the Hebrew, which is originally in Greek, and you'll get a sense of how the Greeks burned Sifrei Torah, which is an example of censorship. Well, let me read it in the Hebrew translation first. Uvechamisha asar yom bekislev, bechamesh ve'arba'im umea shana, bagu shekutz, mishmeim al hamizbeach, uve'are Yehuda misaviv, banu bamot, uve'fotechei habatim, uverachovot zivachu, v'sifrei haTorah asher matzu serafu ba'esh. The Sifrei Torah they found, they burnt to ashes. V'chol asher yimsa biyadav, and all they found in their hands, Sefer Brit, v'chol asher yichafetz b'Torah, tzivah hamelech lahamito. So they were forbidding teaching of Torah, forbidding Brit Milah, forbidding not only keeping kosher, but sacrificing unkosher animals in the Beit HaMikdash. So this is what the Maccabees were objecting to. The Hellenized Syrians in the north of Israel. I'm trying to find the translation. I'm going to translate from the Hebrew. In the 15th day of Kislev, in the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege upon the altar of burnt offering. They also built altars in the surrounding cities of Yehuda and burned incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. The Sifrei Torah, which they found, they tore to pieces and burned with fire. Where the book of the covenant was found in the possession of anyone, or if anyone adhered to the law, the decree of the king condemned him to death. So that's what I read in Hebrew. I could go on. It's from this edition of Sefer HaMaccabim. I think it's chapter 1, around lines 52 through 57. I'm going to put that on the side now. We're coming up with Hanukkah, and I have a Devar Torah that I gave on a WhatsApp about Hanukkah, that the Al Hanisim prayer really celebrates not so much the military victory of the Maccabees. Masechet Shabbat notes the miracle of the oil that was supposed to last one day, Bach Shemen that was pure, and it lasted 8 days. That is a miracle that we celebrate. However, it really is that Hashem turned over the impure to the pure. The mighty, they outnumbered us in might. They had elephants, the Syrian Greeks, that the Maccabees fought against. And basically, we were so outnumbered and outpowered by weaponry that the miracle is the voice of Yaakov, Kol Yaakov, that continues Torah learning in the Shivot of Shem the Aver. And that's what the Syrian Greeks were unable to stamp out. Even that they burned Sifrei Torah, they could not burn out the light of Torah that is in the heart and mind of each Yid. Let's go on with Rabbi Isaac Halevi Herzog Zatal, the first chief rabbi of Israel in 1948. I was mentioning his work on Techelet, and the importance of Josephus for decoding why Rabbi Akiva says Al Tamru Mayim Mayim. I'm not suggesting it's that simple. That's the simple Peshat level. When David HaMelech in the Haftorah on Pesach says, Ani mimayim rabim, I am from great and mighty waters, we can very quickly see that Rabbi Akiva's words have a substance, an usia, that is much more complex and deep than just Josephus' historical remark that Herod's temple was painted with blue marble, and that when the sun was up, it ricocheted off the gold dome and looked like shimmering Mediterranean water. To give you an idea how beautiful Greek culture is on the outside, and yet morally suspect, Herod, who was a Roman, his mother was a Eudemian princess and his father a Ger, he had one of his wives embalmed in honey. And her brother Jason, who was a Kohen, he invited him to a party at Jericho, swimming party, in a swimming pool, and had him drowned, and then covered it up to make it look like an accident. This was a guy, you could be Tului ala Etz, crucified in Jerusalem in Herod's time for jaywalking. He had so many people he put to death. I won't even enumerate some of the examples Josephus gives, that he had to build Masada because he thought somebody would assassinate him. So Roman culture, which is a direct inheritor of the Greek tradition, very different in some ways but similar in others, it shows that morally Herod was a monster. Okay, so it does say bring the beauty of Shem into of Japhet into the tents of Shem, but the model of seeing the deception of light playing on a beautiful blue dome, a blue marble of Herod's temple, is, I think, fitting for this time as we approach Hanukkah. Going back to Rabbi Isaac Halevi Herzog, in his Reverence for Text. When Rabbi Halevi Herzog walked in the streets of Yerushalayim, the Balabatim would rise in honor, as is fitting a Talmud Chacham. And the rabbi was, out of his being Anav Ma'od, his humility, always uneasy with this, even though he shouldn't have been. He was a tremendous Talmud Chacham. And he said, I will never leave my private domain without having a Tanakh, a small little miniature one, in my breast pocket, because when people rise in my presence, as is befitting, they should not honor me, but they should honor the text. So the implication of Rabbi Herzog is that it is the text that a Talmud Chacham embodies, but that's what the people are acknowledging, not necessarily a Melech B'sar B'dam. The Reverence for the Jewish Book, translated into great Jewish book collections in various places. The Rabbi Menachem ben Yehuda, in his introduction to the work Baraita de Rabbi Eliezer and Midrash Agor, published in Safed in 1587, writes, From the day I became bar mitzvah, I deprived myself of food and drink in order to pursue and purchase Sfarim that brought me closer to Hashem. If you're interested in the sources of all these remarkable quotes about reverence for text in Judaism, some of these books mention in the footnotes where I'm pulling these statements down. They're not just hocus pocus out of the blue. So Rabbi Menachem ben Yehuda makes this incredible remark that he deprives himself of nutrition to buy Sfarim. He was not the only one. Another avid gatherer of Sfarim in the 16th century was Rabbi Yosef Shlomo Domeldigo, who lived on the Greek island of Candia, who confesses, I have often traveled hundreds of miles by land and sea without food in order to search out and buy even a small precious volume. Wow. To have any idea how Jews have sacrificed for Sfarim, it's really just remarkable. I once heard at a Shabbos table, there was a Jew in the Holocaust who had a very rare edition of a sefer that he did not bring gold or jewelry with him smuggled on the train when he arrived at Auschwitz. He brought this sefer, which he kept actually sewn to his garment above his heart, and he was summoned before some firing squad, maybe for stealing a potato or something, and they shot him, and the bullet went just into the sefer, which was a rare sefer from Italy, an incunabula, I think it was, and it saved his life. And the thing is that this sefer had been given to him by a big rabbi before the Holocaust, and he said, cherish, revere, and love this text. It will save your life. Did the rabbi know that literally it would? Just food for thought. So we mentioned the Jews would sacrifice for texts. The lovers of great books have viewed them as a way of bringing them closer to Hashem. And I'm going to cut right now to an overview of censorship. And then we'll go back and maybe in a separate lecture and talk about some of the great library collections of modern texts from the Renaissance on in a different lecture. Censorship is such an important topic because the enemies of the Jews have realized that the lifeblood and vitality of the Jewish people is learning. And learning can come from a sefer. Now, I do acknowledge Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik wrote a very important essay on rupture and how people become too bookish after the advent of the printing press and even in the age of Art Scroll. But there's something to be said for the power of a book to bring one closer, particularly for autodidacts. And the enemies of the Jewish book realize this when they burn books, whether it be Antiochus IV in the book of Maccabees or the burning of the Talmud, which will be a separate lecture, which is too complex and long to discuss now. Whenever persecutors of the Jews arose, they vented their destructive hate on the Jewish book, knowing that that would kill the Jews. In the time of the Maccabees, we mentioned Antiochus IV. The Mishnah notes, among the 5 calamities that befell the Jewish people on the 17th of Tammuz was the burning of the Sefer Torah. So I'm going to read this from Tanis 4:6. It's a Mishnah. Chamisha devarim eru et avotenu b'shiva asar b'tamuz b'chamisha b'tisha'a b'av b'shiva asar b'tamuz nishtabaru haluchot uvatal hatamid. The tamid sacrifice stopped. The hubeka'a ha'ir v'saraf up otomos et haTorah. So there it's mentioning some censorship. This apotomos burned Sifrei Torah. And that happened on the 17th of Tammuz as a part of that Mishnah. It's an act of censorship. In the days of the Hadrianic persecution, Torah study was forbidden, and the Talmud records the fate of Rabbi Hanina ben Teredian, who was one of the 10 holy martyrs murdered by the Romans. We memorialize Rabbi Hanina ben Teredian on Yom Kippur, in the liturgy of Yom Kippur. However, it comes from Avodah Zarah, a tractate in the Talmud, particularly 18a and b, and it mentions they brought this Rabbi Hanina ben Teredian to be sentenced and wrapped him in a Sifrei Torah and encircled him with bundles of branches, and they set fire to it. And they brought tufts of wool and soaked them in water and placed them in his heart, so that his soul should not leave his body quickly, a protracted death, but he would die slowly and painfully. His daughter said to him, "Father, must I see you like this?" Rabbi Hanina ben Teredian said to her, "If I alone were being burned, it would be difficult for me. But now that I am burning along with the Sifrei Torah, he who will seek retribution for the insult accorded to the Torah scroll will also seek retribution for the insult accorded to me." Haviehu uvrachu vehikfuhu bechavile zimorot vehetzito bahain et haor veviu sifogin shel zemer b'seraum b'mayim. They put the wool in water. Vehin nichum al libo kidei shelo tetzeh nishmato me chara amra lo beto Abba e'erecha bevacha amar la ilimale ani nisarafti levadi haya hadavar kasha li akshav she'ani nisaraf imi mi shemivakesh el bona shel Sefer Torah hu yivakesh el boni. Let's go on. His student said to him, "Our teacher, Rabbi Hanina, what do you see?" Rabbi Hanina ben Teredian said to them, "I see the parchment burning, but its letters are flying to heaven." They said to him, "You should open your mouth, and the fire will enter, and you will die more quickly." Rabbi Hanina ben Teredian said to them, "It is preferable that he who gave me my soul should take it away, and one should not harm oneself to speed his death." Amru lo Talmidav, "Rabbi, ma ata ro'eh? What do you see?" Amar lehen, Gilyon nisarafin be'otiot parachot af ata patach picha be'tikanes becha ha'esh. Amar lehem, mutav sheyitalana mi shenetana ve'al yechabo bel hu ba'atzamo. So he said that he sees the letters flying to heaven, even though the parchment of the Sefer Torah is burning. Now the executioner even asks. The Katsatonir said to him, "My teacher, if I increase the flame and take off the tufts of the wool from your heart, so that you will die sooner and suffer less, Will you bring me to the life of the Olam Haba? Rabbi Hanina ben Teridyon said to him, to the executioner, yes. The executioner said, take an oath for me that what you say is true. Rabbi Hanina ben Teridyon took the oath for him, and the executioner immediately increased the flame and took off the tufts of wool from his heart, causing his soul to leave his body quickly. The executioner too leaped and fell into the fire and died. A divine voice emerged and said, Rabbi Hanina ben Teridyon and the executioner are destined for Olam Haba. Upon hearing this, Rabbi Yehuda Nazi wept and said, there is one who acquires his share of Olam Haba in a Augenblick, Arif Ayin, such as the executioner, and there is one who acquires his share in Olam Haba after lifetimes, or you could say lifetimes, of Torah toil, such as Rabbi Hanina ben Teridyon. This is an act of censorship, and it's appropriate for us to remember at this time as Hanukkah approaches. It's liturgized in the Holy Martyrs in the Yom Kippur liturgy. So it's absolutely remarkable. By the way, the Gemara says that his death was forecasted and predicted earlier. You have to see the whole context. But here's somebody willing to die for the Sefer Torah and teaching Torah. And even though the Sefer Torah is burning, the letters are flying to heaven. In the medieval ages, in June of 1244, 24 cartloads of Hebrew volumes I mentioned were burned. In the first lecture I mentioned had to do with the ressentiment of the disputation in 1240 with Rabbi Yehiel. And the friars, the Dominicans in particular, fried 24 cartloads outside Notre Dame Cathedral. The Kinus lament prayer opens by Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg for the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. O ye who are seared in the flames, pray for the peace of thy mourners, the mourners for Yerushalayim, Avlei Tzion. Later in history, the Spanish inquisitor under Yamach Shemo Thomas Torquemada further burnt many Jewish books, as recounted as the eyewitness Rabbi Abraham Sebag, who notes that possession of a Jewish book warranted execution. Again, see my books for if you want the sources of this Rabbi Abraham Sebag and others for these statements of reverence for Jewish texts. So Rabbi Sebag gives a long account, I'm only going to briefly mention it, of people who were put at the stake for owning Hebrew books by this Inquisition headed by Thomas Torquemada. Many Jews did not escape and were found owning Hebrew books and burned at the stake by the Inquisition. In Rome, Italy, on Rosh Hashanah 1553, all found tomes of the Talmud were set aflames at Campo dei Fiori, and the eyewitness, Rabbi Yehuda Lerma, in his book Lechem Yehuda, published in Sabioneto in 1554, writes, I translate, on Rosh Hashanah, the Curia of Rome issued an edict in all countries, and they burned the Talmud and all works allied thereof. Also on the month of Mar Heshvan, my authored books, which were recently printed, were burnt. 1,500 volumes in all were set to flames. So I was forced to begin all over and write from memory. Amazing. This Rabbi Yehuda Lerma, in his Lechem Yehuda, recomposed it out of memory because the texts were burned in Italy. It's going to be a separate lecture. It's too much to cover with the burning of books during the Nazi period. But I do want to mention there's the burning of books has extended to the period of persecution of Jews in Russia. I'll tell the personal story. My mother's cousin's husband, Dr. R.A. Volsker, at that time, the communists forbid Jews to publish in Hebrew characters, except for Yiddish. Yiddish was a folk language, so it was allowed. And so he made remarkable, important discoveries of unknown poems of Rav Yehuda Levi that he found in the Saltykov Library Firkovich collection. And yet, he didn't have avenues to publish it, so he had to publish it in Yiddish publications. And he also was involved in a smuggling act, because there were censors. As the Romans had censors, There are censors in Russia. And he sent them through the mail, translated in Yiddish, Rav Yehuda Levy's poems. And the Kohen Gadol, Ezra Fleischer, of medieval Hebrew poetry, of the Cairo Geniza medieval poetry Hebrew unit in Israel that had been relocated from Berlin under the philanthropy of Shakin. We should acknowledge Shakin sponsored this wonderful scholarship. And anyway, Ezra Fleischer would receive these letters in the mail from my grandmother's first cousin's husband, Dr. Aryeh Vilsker, and he would translate them from Yiddish into Hebrew, and then he would check them in some humongous catalog at Heichal Shlomo and verify that indeed they were unknown poems of Rav Yehuda Levi, not found in the Shadal collection or the Brody collection. And this literally rocked the scholarly world. You had cab drivers talking about the discoveries of Dr. Aryeh Vilsker. I mention it only because in Russia at this time, it was forbidden to write one Hebrew character except in Yiddish. You could write in Yiddish, but not in Hebrew. So how would this great scholar and his great discoveries, be known? They were known through smuggling through the mail system under the radar of the censor and sent to Ezra Fleischer, the Kohen Gadol of medieval Hebrew poetry. He actually pioneered his career in many areas of Jewish studies. He wrote wonderful essays on the Kedusha. We get it from Haftorah Yitro, Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzavot, Melech Haaretz Kavano. Well, he wrote on the origin in the Cairo Geniza of the refraction of Haftorah Yitro through the liturgy of why that's in the Kedusha of the Shemona Esrei. But he also wrote many important things on Ibn Danish Labrat, who is very famous, most well known for Dor Yikra. Dor Yikra Levenevat. I love the Sephardic melody. So Fleischer was a great scholar in Ibn Labrat, but he was also involved in this clandestine work to disseminate unknown poems of Rav Yehuda Levi that this great scholar Aryeh Vilsker was discovering in the Saltykov Library for Kowich Geniza, essentially. And actually, many people don't know that Ezra Fleischer tried to bring Aryeh Vilsker to Harvard's Widener Library under a joint position of lecturing in medieval history, Jewish history, and being a librarian there, the head librarian. Let's wrap it up. Conclusion. Heinrich Heine was not incorrect that the burning of Jewish books would inevitably lead to burning Jews. But if we stop there with this platitude, we fail to better understand the secret dynamic of how the Jewish spirit is inextricably tied to the Jewish learning represented in Jewish texts, oral and written, and how censorship of those texts is the first step for any anti-Semite in an ultimate censorship of the human text, Jews, which is to censor Jewish lives in mass. That is one of the lessons we learn from the account of the Eila Ezkara, recalled in the liturgy of Yom Kippur. We who do have utmost high regard for the plight of the Torah, because we revere, cherish, and love Jewish text, are prudent to recall the last words of Rav Chanina ben Turgin, who was wrapped in the Sefer Torah with wet wool for protracted and cruel and painful death. I will say it again. If it were I alone being burnt, it would have been a thing hard to bear. But now that I am burning together with the Sefer Torah, he who will have regard for the plight of the Torah will also have regard for my plight. His disciples called out to him, Father, teacher, Rabbi, what seest thou? He answered, the parchment is burning, but the letters are flying to heaven. The Gemara goes on to describe black fire on white fire and what that could possibly mean in the paradoxical esoteric mystery of censorship that is encrypted in the riddle that perhaps explains a tincture of the inexplicable link, an essential bond for the infinite love, reverence, and cherishing of text by Jewish scholars across millennia, and why censorship of any form of those texts is so tragic, and indeed the first step in any planned Judaicide. From the spiritual annihilation planned by the Greek Antiochus and Maccabees, to physical planned annihilation by the Roman censors, to the Crusader thugs storming across Europe, memorialized in the liturgy of Tisha B'Av and the Kines, to physical planned annihilation by the Roman censors and the Crusader thugs, the Inquisition fixated to ferret out heresy by Thomas Torquemada, to Nazi boycott burnings, and more recently censorship of burnings of books in former Soviet Union. Censorship of texts leads to censorship of Jewish persons as texts yearning to be interpreted as a field of force. By placing the Nazi censorship of Jewish books that led to ultimate censorship of Jewish lives in its historical context, we better understand the dynamic of European Jewry rabbinic culture and its love, reverence, and cherishing of text in written and oral form. Thus, the relationship of the text in general and Jews as a universal, eternal, unique people who the Muslims call the people of the book is revealed. A unique people, a people with a sacred text, a book that has, as the Chafetz Chaim in that beautiful passage that I just translated, has made ornaments and castles and palaces of sapphire and diamond and gems, all stemming from the Sinai revelation that trickled down into the Tanakh and its commentaries, which are super commentaries and super commentaries. This unique people and the book are the victims of Holocaust throughout the millennium. And the secret esoteric dynamic that makes any Judicide or an attempted Judicide in history unique is because of the unique Jewish people's relationship to text. That's what I'm trying to convey in this second lecture in our series on the censorship of Hebraica and Judaica. Because text, we understand, is a term with sublime depths. It doesn't mean a physical text. Human beings are texts interpreting, yearning to be interpreted. Everybody is a Merkava, a chariot for Hashem's divine presence. A text that has the potential for levels of Kedusha, that conveys a unique and singular role as the destiny and the spirit of the Jewish people in history has. Just as Eliyahu HaNavi ascended in a fiery chariot to the heavens, transmogrified alive to the heavenly court, so too witnesses of Nazi book burnings, if we understand what the Nazis were trying to destroy, and the importance of remembrance, preservation, and internalization of Jewish texts, proclaim with Eliyahu's disciple, my father, the chariots of Israel and the horsemen thereof." The rabbinic riders of the heavenly chariot who descend to the Merkava, Yoredei le Merkava le'aleh le'achalot, to ascend to the seven palaces, are indeed expert horsemen of hermeneutical interpretation of the spiritual chariot unique to the Jewish people, the text. Just as there is an earthly chariot below, there's a heavenly chariot above. And just as there is a Beit Din below, there's a Beit Din Mamala. Just as there are Kol Elionot, there are Kol Elyonim, Tachtonim. Just as there are heavenly waters, there are waters below. When the traces of Hazal's wisdom are committed to the flames or censorship in any form, the substance of their eternal teachings is not wiped out by attempts to reduce the sepulchres of Torah preserved in the books to ashes. For certain, the angels of Hashem will revive those ashes with the dews of resurrection, transported on the wings of angels to the throne of glory before the King of Kings, who remembers the past, present, and future simultaneously, and even beyond time itself, the particular destiny and spiritual salvation that makes for redemption, the unique mission of each precious soul of a holy people Israel, likened to each letter of Torah, which itself is an encryption of Hashem's holy names, proclaiming the symphony of divine creation from the beginning of beginnings, through the revelation of Shir HaShirim, to find eschatological redemption, B'yamei Achronim, to even beyond the doctrine of Shemitah HaOlamot of the Ramban, or the year 50,000 of Shari Bina, of the universe's creation, after the seven worlds hosting 7,000 years are enacted on the stage of temporal unfolding. Indeed, the year of the disembodied intellects, the heavenly unfolding of ultimate Bina emanating from the Sephira of Malchut. Malchut hinted at on the yard site of David HaMelech on Shavuos, corresponding to the ultimate Yovel, when Hashem will be one and his name will be one, and the text of the generations of the heavens finally written as told on Rosh Hashanah, sealed on Yom Kippur, and delivered to Hashem's holy archive, a metaphor, by the heavenly archons, malachim, angels, on Hoshana Rabbah. Hoshana Rabbah was purposely, along with Tisha B'Av, chosen as a day for the mass murder of millions of Jews by the Nazi satanic logic, which was ingenious, demonically clever, and completely consistent with divine providence, that the Jew and the text are ultimately one. I want to thank Rabbi Weisblum for this invitation to offer the second lecture on the burning or censorship of Judaica and Hebraica, and we will be moving on in our further lectures on the censorship of the Talmud, which could take seminars and years to unfold, and certainly an area of more of my expertise, which is Nazi censorship of not only precious Hebrew manuscripts, and we'll get into the details of that to some extent, but also secular works of Freud and Stefan Zweig and Thomas Mann and H.G. Wells and countless other secular works that were considered decadent Jewish literature. So I hope you're looking forward to the future lectures on the censorship of Jewish books. Islam calls us the people of the book, but as one quip has it, we are the people of the books, because that Sinaitic revelation could be likened to the metaphor of a pebble dropped in a pond, and each subsequent generation is a ripple in the pond, and like rings on a tree, or when archaeologists look at fossil evidence in the rocks, we see that the books are the rings, and to swim upstream to that original ripple requires going through an authoritative tradition of generations of rabbinic scholarship, an authoritative reception history, which is a mission for the Rambam as the purpose of the search for Chokhmah Bina V'das and the life of the mind. I return to our first lecture and the opening of this second lecture. This Sefer, Rambam promises you, is the key with which you can open the gates of heaven. And whether you might not be meriting a Rabbi Akiva, who's a 1 in a billion, to be able to enter the Pardes in this world, Olam Hazeh, as our soul will make that journey, we should know this text so well, by memory, bapeh, that when we just recall the chapter headings, our mind takes us there. And the wisdom, understanding, and knowledge gained up from this text will usher us like a key into the chambers of divine wisdom, of the springs of wisdom, excavated by holy angels that clear up the contradictions like Eliyahu Navi, B'yamei Mashiach. We thank Rabbi Weisblum and Alida Portnoy for this chance to offer this offering of the reverence, cherishing, and love of Hebrew text. Thank you.